Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone here today, elected representatives, senior civil servants and members of the public alike. Our session this afternoon is with the Policy and Resources Committee, and in this hearing we'll be focusing on the work of the State's Property Unit. Our panel this afternoon consists of myself, Deputy Hayley Camp, member of the Scrutiny Management Committee, and Advocate Charisma Lyle, who's a non-states member of the SMC, and we're joined by the Vice President of the Committee, Deputy Liam McKenna. Following this event, the committee will decide on any further actions or activity will be commissioned as part of the overall scrutiny review. But turning to the arrangements for today, I can confirm that a Hansard script will be available from this proceeding and will be published in due course. So just to confirm, this is a parliamentary proceeding and therefore members of the public are not permitted, I'm afraid, to ask questions or comment during today's session. So can I ask everybody with mobile devices to put them on silent? So it's essential during the session that the committee is able to hear from our witnesses without any interruption from the gallery. So firstly, may I start for our witnesses for the record, could you just please introduce yourselves? We'll start in the middle, if I may. Just for the record, if we can all introduce ourselves.
Can I just check the mics are just on? We don't have to press them, yeah? Right, thank you. I'm Deputy Lindsay de Summers and I'm the President of PNR.
Deputy Gavin St Pierre, the Resources Lead for Policy and Resources.
So, Mark Osier, Director of Estates.
Nothing.
And Jason Moriarty, Chief Operating Officer.
Hello, Jason. Okay, so across the next 2 hours, we'll explore three overarching themes, we hope. Effectiveness, whether the property unit is delivering against the objectives set for it. Governance, whether the lines of accountability are clear. And value for money and how budgets are controlled and how major spending decisions are justified. We have a structure. I've got to keep us to time. We have just under 2 hours. We will take a break, some indeterminate point in the middle. So to the first question, we'll start with objectives, if we may. And Martin Osier, very kindly, Mark Osier, actually not Martin, sorry, my apologies, very kindly provided a briefing document to us previously as part of the preparations for this hearing, and within that you outlined the SPU's mandate, which is very helpful. And you explained that the mandate of the SPU is to provide professional portfolio management and sustainable property solutions for the States of Guernsey, underpinned by technical and strategic expertise, delivering an efficient, economical and a fit-for-purpose estate. So that's all very well and good, sir. In that vein, may I ask what the current strategic objectives of the SPU are today and how do they align with the broader objectives of the States? Deputy, I was looking at Mark there because he had scripted this, but I appreciate you might wish to start, but I'm looking at you, sir.
Yes, I'm happy to pick up on that. I think the State's Property Unit itself is very wide-ranging in terms of the services that it delivers. And predominantly, if we look at where it is, the operational aspects form the largest part of that. So the delivery of the hard and soft FM, those operational delivery across the estate forms the lion's share of the work we do. So looking at that, part of what we are looking at is how do we provide that fit-for-purpose estate. So it's providing a suitable estate for the delivery of those operational aspects, be that across the school estate, hospital, or any of our operational assets. And that ranges all the way from public conveniences, as I say, through to the historical properties as well. So when we look at delivering a fit-for-purpose estate, it is wide-reaching to try and create an estate that can deliver for those operational uses that come out of those buildings.
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of that fit-for-purpose estate, that objective there, how is it translated into a measurable performance indicator and what evidence is there that that's being met?
I think we have service standard documents that we look at across the organisation. Those are not designed to be full SLAs because we're an internal service deliverer in different areas. But overall, we look at what are the services that we should be delivering, how are we delivering those, and whether or not we are meeting the expectations within those services. From an operational point of view, do you mean broader than that?
Just sort of specifics of, I mean, that might be an operational detail, but specifically, what's your KPI for the unit? At the end of the year, you turn around and say, look, we achieved X. That was what we set out to do.
Again, we don't have specific, they're not measurable KPIs that we look at. We do have a number that we look at in terms of looking at our property rationalisation programme, whether or not we can, what we're looking at in terms of generating receipts for that. But obviously that is something that is very much determined on operational direction of the states that we are not necessarily completely in control of.
So no measurable KPIs per se?
No.
But in the briefing paper, you said that since its formation, the SPU has driven significant efficiencies. So could you just quantify those?
Yeah, so when we're looking at the efficiencies that we've looked at, it's across the delivery of those services. So how we deliver our services across the portfolio. So we have a number of staff that deliver services across the portfolio, how we deliver those. So when we're looking at efficiencies, we're looking at energy efficiency. So we have a programme to try and introduce energy efficiency across the estate. So we look at changing, in simple terms, it's looking at, well, how are we using our energy? Do we change?
So we would expect year-on-year reductions in energy usage, possibly?
It's certainly something we are trying to achieve, yes. Now, there are areas that we are looking at about how we can do that, and I think a reference in the document that we would very much like to get to energy performance certificates at a time in the future. We're not there yet, because we just don't have the background data or the systems that allow us to accurately collect that data. So yes, we're striving to make those types of improvements, but there is still work to go.
But again, in the document you did say who has driven. Now, you would use the past tense. You're talking about striving, which is the sort of present participle there. What significant efficiencies that you claim in the briefing paper have you delivered?
Well, the actual delivery of the target operating model reduced the number of staff that were in there. So we saw an efficiency from the numbers of staff and a reduction when the unit came into formation. And then it's trying to deliver that same level of services with a reduced headcount, but actually seeing and continuing to deliver those services in a much more challenging arena. So we've seen a very considerable increase in areas that require or have legislation along them. So our statutory compliance obligations have gone up significantly in the past few years, and we have managed to deliver those without actually detriment to the rest of the service. So we've had to drive efficiencies in other areas in terms of our staff, in terms of our delivery, and
so
our management of the third-party
contractors. Quantified the number of staff have gone down over the last 2 years?
Not over the last 2 years. As I say, that was when we delivered.
Right, okay. But nothing else to quantify. But, okay, I'll move on from objectives now, because I was about to get into budgeting there when we talked about it, but I don't feel the need to do anything more just yet. I just wanted to get a sense of the objectives that you'd be working to, because the briefing paper does talk a lot about the target operating model and how much you've achieved that, or working towards achieving it, I should say. So, Deputy Camp, if you would like to cover any questions on, if I move to you next, as it were, I'm quite happy.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I wanted to ask really as a sort of high-level summary, what policies are in place around the work that the SPU does, particularly around that sort of cradle-to-grave sort of process that I think it's anticipated the SPU participates in.
Are you talking?
Yes or not?
Are you talking about? Are you talking about the kind of services that SPU provides? So, for example, from the design stage of fit for purpose, or taking a look at the current property portfolio and making sure that they can be best adapted and to the end of life, so repurposing. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not clear on the question.
It's purposely a wide-ranging question because the SPU appears to have a lot within it, and that's what I'm essentially asking. Why I've started quite an open question is what are the major policies that kind of govern what you do and how you do it, essentially, to try and start to understand how all that's pulled together.
Can I just make a sort of preamble comment on this while Mark maybe thinks of some specifics? I think this bounces off the questions that Deputy Sloan started with, really. And I appreciate it's a little bit frustrating trying to pin down specific metrics, etc. But the fact that we can actually get any metrics at all, which you have seen pulled together in the briefing paper, I think is testament to the fact that we've taken a much more professional approach, or Mark's team has taken a much more professional approach compared with the very much more ad hoc way property was managed in the days before the PTOM and the SPU. So I think it's helpful to understand that the starting position was very much more dislocated. We didn't have any of the kind of policies that you're referring to, Deputy Camp, or not necessarily consistently applied. And so I think that is one of the advantages. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, this is still a relatively new process, so we appreciate there's an awful lot more to do. One of the metrics that we do have and have included in the briefing paper is an estimate, for example, of the backlog of maintenance that's still required to catch up, and it's that kind of thing. We do appreciate we're not there yet. But I think the fact that we can take a much more consistent approach to property, a much more rational one, and take that sort of government overarching view rather than ad hoc per committee area is progress in its own right.
I think
I can see what you're saying, but Mark, you did say that he didn't actually have any particular measure that he was working towards. So if we're looking to improvements, it's nice to know year on year what it is that we're improving. So, a holistic approach sounds very nice on paper, and a more professional approach sounds very nice. But it is, again, I'm trying to strive down to what's in terms of the delivery. That's where we're coming from. So, sorry,
no, please.
Yeah, I think there are a number of aspects where I think we can, because I think, as has been pointed out, the unit itself is very broad and very wide and covers a number of different areas. So if I can break it down into the three areas.
Yeah.
So if we look at delivery of projects, so we have a team that looks at a delivery of projects. And that is essentially our maintenance and minor work. So it's classed as routine capital. That now is any project up to a value of £3 million. So whilst it used to be called minor, I'm not sure many people would call it minor anymore. We have seen, and if we look at a sort of measurable difference, one of the objectives that we set at the beginning of this was that the spend on that was not enough, looking across the estate, and actually wasn't keeping track with the budget that had been allocated to it. And in terms of where we measure it and look at it, one of our key objectives over the years was to increase that spend to be able to try and get on top of the routine maintenance of those other areas. And just to sort of run you through and to give you some figures, in 2021, that was a spend of 2.2 million, in 22 went up to 3.4, 23, 4.8, 24 got up to 7.1, which was our target to get to in terms of the routine capital spend. And at this year, we're at 5.6 million. So again, on target to hit that spend. Now, that was a real measurable desire that we had to try and rectify some of the underspend on the estate. And that, coupled with obviously the rationalisation to try and reduce the numbers of properties, is trying to remedy some of those areas. So there are some areas that we are very focused on in terms of that spend, some of those areas. When we switch into the operational side of things, which really is the delivery, and that, I'm sure as you've seen from the documents, runs all the way from the laundry at the PH through to all the housekeepers, through to school caretakers. So it is and then premises managers across the whole estate. So that's looking at actually keeping things running. Now, obviously, we look at the numbers of tickets that come through there, the numbers of jobs that are being done. Reactive maintenance on the health estate alone gets sort of 6,000 tickets a year. And the planned preventative maintenance is around the same. Now, we are looking at ways that we can get on top of that to drive that forward. So we are recording these matrices and looking at them and seeing about what we can do to improve those. But a lot on the operational side and the delivery of those are those day-to-day services of, we can go through how many things we wash in the laundry or how many beds we clean. Those are measurable, but doesn't mean, we can see what they are. We try and drive efficiencies in terms of what are the staff numbers, can we do it? And we're reviewing that all the time. We're going through a process now of looking at saying what are the staff numbers that we can deliver a lot of those operational services. And that's predominantly where our big spend is. So it is, we are always reviewing those staff efficiencies that can drive that, which really underlines some of those performance indicators of can we continue to deliver the services that we are at a reduced cost, which is something that underlines everything that the staff are always looking at.
Yeah, and again, I suppose when it comes back down to it, it was measures, which is the first question about your KPIs, which we didn't have. But in terms of, obviously, spending more money could be a metric of success, but how do you, and I want to come back to Deputy Camp's got some questions on governance, but I'll throw governance questions in there. When you've got routine maintenance, how do you decide? I mean, who gets the routine maintenance? You've got all these different departments, you've P&I, you've got the head of resources, or chief operations officer, my apologies. Who's the master in all of this, or mistress?
So that there is a governance structure that sits behind the routine capital process, which is routine capital management board, and then it's broken down into various categories, of which I am one of the category heads. We run a annualised process that looks at across all of those different areas, and we take submissions from every single operational area of the estate that is eligible to come under the routine capital banner. Previously and prior to PTOM, that would have been the different service areas that would have fed those in. Now it is a lot of the staff that sit under the SPU, but there are some outside of that as well that feed into that. We send out a full assessment criteria that goes out to all of those areas with a very clear scoring and assessment area and a submission. So this is what we expect from you. This is the information we expect. This is how we will score it. Those all come in, and they are often well exceed the budget that we have available. Those will come in and then they are scored on each of those assessments in two categories. We have maintenance works, which forms the lion's share because that's really what it's there for, and then minor works, and those are service delivery changes to properties. So if somebody has a reason why they want to do that, and that forms a portion of the work, assuming that they have merit. That's then scored by a panel of 3 people within SPU who scored across the categories. That's then shared back out to those areas. I think there's a copy of the flowchart in the documentation. That is then given an opportunity for those operational areas, and that's not just the property people, that's the operational service leads to review that and make any representations about the scoring and the way that those have been scored and assessed, which then produces a ranking of where those would score and therefore the prioritised list of projects to be delivered.
And this is for projects down to what sort of size, sir?
This is down to around £20,000. And things, I mean, generally, it's because of, it's the difference between revenue and capital and where that falls. Generally, capital is anything that will increase the capital, but there is, some of them could fall into either way.
That sounds a lot. Have you ever done a time and motion study about the resources that go into that prioritisation?
Haven't done time and motion. We've looked at it, but yes, it is resource intensive. But it is to be able to prioritise what that looks at, and because the estate is so varied, and I think it could be if you looked across the estate and looked at prioritisation of maintenance works, and you did it in a very linear, simplistic way. I think you'd find that hospitals and schools would always end up with the lion's share of the funding. Because we have a very diverse estate and other areas such as Castle Corner to other actually have for that particular service area are incredibly important. So actually trying to judge across those areas. So we look at across the metrics in terms of how do we score it. It's looking at a really broad section of, what are the improvements, what difference will it make, what proportion of the public will be impacted by it, does it include accessibility, does it include energy efficiency, what's the payback period. So actually it looks across a large numbers of metrics to try and come up with a way that we can prioritise what is effectively limited funds to deliver the best value for the portfolio. And so yes, well I agree the process takes a little bit of time, but actually we've got quite slick at it now. We are quite quick at it.
I presume this isn't a process you're doing every time the unit does have there are some assumptions in there that can be consistent all the way through. So how have these policies adapted to build in those things which are always true? Example, that people will generally prioritise certain things over others, and you've got to balance that. So how, I suppose, to, again, sort of following on Andy's point about how you deliver that sort of efficiency and KPI and demonstrate that there is sort of that improvement, how has all that learning come together to streamline that process?
So we've reviewed it. We look at it annually when we look at the process, to look at how can we streamline that part of the process, and then how do we deliver within that process. So we have gone from quite a manual process to a more online process in terms of how we deliver it. So it's each year we look at how can we make this a bit easier to be able to do that. The scoring has become more simple. The submissions have become better over the years as we have trained people to give us better submissions, which means that the scoring process has become much quicker. I think we've looked at it a number of different ways, and we've tried to assess it differently. But the reality is, to try and balance the needs and the hugely diverse submissions that we have in, you do need quite a comprehensive process to go through, because otherwise, as I say, it would be very easy to have it, 10 submissions from the hospital, prioritise all of those, and then the rest of the estate wouldn't get a look in. And when we're looking at things as down to public toilets and other areas, actually those have very high public engagement and public usage, and so become something that actually score relatively highly.
Yeah, I mean, we were, so the purpose of my questions were to sort of look at the sort of governance side, because clearly there's, these are complex estates. There's a lot of public money sort of focused around it. And when we started looking at things like, for instance, like the Thornton report, which is talking about kind of governance around projects and things like that, there were a number of issues that were sort of found. And so I think what we're trying to understand as well is how those lessons are being learned in the processes that the SPU is following. Generally to the extent that they absolutely apply. Yes,
I think two different levels there. The Thornton report was generally looking at major capital delivery, much higher level. What we are doing is we are delivering maintenance across the estate. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, we are delivering from 20,000 up to multiple millions, but actually those are generally, those bigger projects are a roofing project, a significant one-off delivery of those. So yes, those sort of recommendations, whilst we look at them, actually applying everything at the major capital level to what is routine capital would become hugely cumbersome.
That's what my question was, Jason's question. How do you, in terms of major projects, therefore, determine where the buck stops, what role the property unit has, what role P&R has, what role the department has?
So if, before I get on to that question, President, can I just go back to sort of the question you asked before around the setting of what was the strategic objectives and how we look at the value that is, just to add a comment, which I think is an interesting benchmark.
We can come back to that, Dave,
okay.
Because we just want to keep this one.
So in terms of the major projects, the way that I would split that out is the business as usual, the general revenue expenditure within those general revenue budgets. Then there is the process that Mark has just described, which is with the routine capital and the allocations, the categories and the prioritisation that takes place, and looking around that on a needs basis and the submissions that come in from all of the service areas and the decision around where that expenditure is allocated, and then the review of the success or otherwise of those projects and ensuring that we learn the lessons before we go back out to the next round. On the major capital, that comes down to obviously the pipeline of major projects that comes through. That is as a result of engagement with the respective committees, understanding what may already be in pipeline, looking at where we are with the existing capital portfolio and then preparing for the next round. And then that is around taking those back to P&R, re-engaging with committees, understanding what the recommendations are to P&R around where those priorities would be. But ultimately, that's the state's decision around where those capital projects would sit within the next capital portfolio.
And I suppose why we ask it is because the public perception, certainly perhaps my perception coming in, is that if you form a property unit with the expertise sitting around that area, why isn't that area utilised more on major projects as routine? So I think we're just trying to understand the relationship.
Yeah, no, so in relation to what we have to remember when we're looking at major projects, construction element will be just one aspect of that in relation to digital and technology, wider sort of delivery projects. There's also those around building out and sort of new requirements that we have to provide for the state of Guernsey and for the community. Then there'll be a lot about maintenance and replacement around what we need to do to replace those assets. In relation to learning in terms of construction, one of the things that you highlighted, Deputy Camp, was the Thornton Review. And across all of those major projects, what we've identified is we've actually, whether it's the Director of Estates or one of the senior team or others, we've upweighted the involvement of the key professional and technical team members on each of those capital projects. But we've also identified, and that's sometimes through the advisory that we have, through the Estates Property Unit, sometimes externally. So if there is specialist requirements, whether that may be on an education estate or something, it could be something far-ranging as an incinerator or repairs to a crematorium or the hospital estate, then we are looking to procure and engage expert professional advice to work in collaboration with SPU and to advise those programmes accordingly.
Okay, I suppose, where does the buck stop then in terms of one of these major projects? There's lots of different parties involved. What's the role of the SPU in a major construction project? So
in terms of major construction, if the SRO, the Senior Responsible Officer, reports into the principal committee or of the sponsoring committee, because obviously the states will allocate the funding into that committee.
Committee that's responsible.
So it's the committee that has that responsibility for that programme, and the SRO reports into that committee. Does the committee actually have in-house property expertise to sit as the SRO there? So the SPU will allocate, so they will sit as a member of the programme board, but as I say, on occasions they will also have external property advisory where the aspects are either technical expertise.
But it's not necessary then that the SPU member would be the SRO.
No, absolutely
So the SRO could be somebody with, for argument's sake, no relevant experience or qualifications in the wider area.
What's most important is that's the right combination of expertise from a number of different skills and disciplines that sit around a programme board.
Okay.
Just use the incinerator. Jason's just mentioned the incinerator, and I think that's a really interesting example, actually, because it links back to your earlier question about measurable efficiencies. So that project has been a really interesting project from a state's perspective, including some very valuable input from this team. And weirdly, I was first involved in it with a different hat on, so I see it from a different perspective. But not only does it cross two different departments, it produces something that's quite a novel solution. But actually, in the process of that and in the process of figuring it all out, it produces a really notable waste saving. So it massively reduces the amount of waste that is actually generated and needs to be dealt with. So it drives efficiency in that respect as well.
Okay.
But, I was going to say, in terms of governance, I mean, there's clearly projects that are under £3 million are dealt with by the Routine Capital Board. So projects above that, as Jason has said, it is likely that even though our largest construction projects are not just construction projects, it's about delivering a project of which property is simply a part. So I think it would be quite unusual to expect the SRO would be certainly coming from the property side, but certainly their participation at the project board level is where you'd expect to see the professional input and the professional expertise. I mean, there is a whole separate discussion that we could have, no doubt, at a separate hearing about the governance around large capital projects and the role of SROs and whether we have the right SROs, and that's something that Policy and Resources are...
It does come to the role of the unit. You know, where does the SPU sit in all of this? Is it the sponsoring department? You know, and it's like, well, are we trying to sort of stick a square peg in a round hole, as it were? But you should say. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Deputy Secretary, I do agree. That's a very helpful answer. In terms of, I'm going to move across now. I'm cognizant of time. Charisma. Would you terms of resourcing and governance, but if you'd would you like to sort of move on to a question in terms of resourcing with it with...
Yes, so we have heard quite a bit about the wide-ranging responsibilities of the unit, and we've also heard about the engagement of specialist resources, particularly at the larger capital levels. What I'd like to talk about is actually the resourcing of the unit itself. So how do you assess whether or not the unit has sufficient capacity and capability to manage the property portfolio?
So as part of when the target operating model was envisaged and brought into use, was a review of the resourcing that was needed to deliver the level of service across the estate. And I think at that time, it was an assessment that the bringing together of those services should over time see improvements in terms of efficiency, but actually was a point in time to say, you know, we're not looking to vastly improve them, but we are looking to stay static and then see improvements. And that included an assessment of the number of staff that were across the unit and what they did. And so that was a complete sort of workforce review to look at where are they sitting, have we got enough to deliver this, what are the numbers, and that includes a review of vacancies and other factors. So there was a review at that time. What we have seen since that point, and obviously we've been going through a stage of looking at that and getting into a steady state, there are areas that have changed over that time. So health and safety and resources, and as I mentioned earlier, compliance, which is a major area which has seen a significant uptick in terms of resource requirement. And then generally actually, you know, how the work has to be carried out in other areas. So we are going through a review all the time of the resources. Part of that is a balance. I think we've talked about the increase in delivery in terms of the routine capital. That's driven by a review of how we delivered our services, a greater use of outsource in those areas, and actually using our internal team for the slightly harder, more technically challenging projects. Clarence Battery being a prime example of really technically difficult challenges which the marketplace couldn't deliver, and we had to bring in-house and deliver. So some of those areas we look at. Other areas where we can outsource to deliver, we use it. So we use a mix of in-source and outsource to deliver the projects and to deliver services across the whole estate. So it does flex and it does change, but it is that review of what are we delivering, how are we trying to deliver it. So that review of how many resources, what does it look like, and that composure of the resources, as I say, because we have a hybrid model of outsource and in-source, it does change over time.
And is there any specific criteria that you use when determining whether or not to use your internal resources or to outsource an activity?
There is, and it does depend. So if you look at the operational side of the business, we generally use our in-source for those areas that are more technically complex. So even if we are talking about cleaning provisions, we outsource a lot of those areas that are more routine, so offices, schools and other areas. We in-source and use our specialist teams for things like operating theatres and other areas where there is technically difficult areas that we have to do, and also challenging working times. You know, we run a cleaning team from 6 in the morning till 3 in the morning the next morning. So we run some really challenging shifts over those times. So we balance that look of, well, where can we use in-source? And there's other areas where we deliver. So we run the only crematorium on the island. So where we offer unique services, and the same, we are the only place on the island that runs steam mains other than the power station. So there are lots of those areas where actually we're quite specialist, so we hold those specialist skills in-house because actually it is the most efficient use of those resources. Where we are more routine, those areas, so various testing, compliance areas, we outsource those. But it is, as I say, it's a balance of that, where do we best use those resources? And when we get to the project work, that's the same. We hold a number of different specialist skills in-house. So in particular, we, on our project side, specialist skills in terms of sea walls and sea defences and repointing. And that extends to our engineering team where we look at cliff stabilisation and other areas. However, some of the geotechnical work, which is very specialist, we will bring external consultants in to do that. M&E work we'll generally outsource because we don't hold that in-house. And then where we've got delivery of projects, we'll assess them. So actually, if it's a relatively simple roofing piece of work, we might outsource that. Where it's a more complex piece of work that's actually on heritage buildings, we have surveyors in-house that are very good at that and will deliver that. So we assess on a project basis between that. So again, we've been running a fairly project up at the fire station recently, which as a heritage building comes with its own complexities. We use our in-house resources to deliver those. So it is a balance of looking at what is the project, what's the best resource to do that, and how can we deliver it in the most efficient way across all of those.
Now you've talked about, you do have a process, a written policy. Are there records kept of these decisions when they are made? When you decide you're going to, actually we don't have the expertise on a one-off basis to provide this service, but we're going to outsource it. Are there written documentation on the making of these decisions to insource or outsource an activity? And you have a policy, a machine-written policy somewhere?
No, this is, as I say, on a project-by-project basis, we look at what the resources are, what we look at it, and we look at a resource plan at the beginning of the year to say, well, where are we going to focus our resources, where are we best to use our internal resource and external resources. Obviously, that projects team is relatively small, and so we know where we're going to focus those areas, and they'll look at that. Across the operational area, as part of the PTOM, that look of blend of in-source, outsource was part of that process. And we looked at a complete range of services of should it be a completely outsourced operational delivery or should it be completely in-sourced? And it was, the outcome of that was actually that balance of a hybrid solution is actually best for the way that we deliver our service and the way the island is. We then manage that internally about where's the best way to do that. And things do change, obviously, as skills change. So that is I don't think it needs a written policy that we definitely outsource all of that, because that's not the way it would work. We definitely insource that, because actually these are based on specific circumstances at that time. And it's very much, it's also driven by, have I got the internal resources to be able to deliver these areas, or actually am I having to use sometimes more expensive externals to do that? So it is a balance the whole time.
But do you keep a written record of those decisions?
Yes, well, in any of the projects, it will be decided, yes, absolutely. If this is going to be outsourced, insourced, that is through the normal project process.
If I can just add, sometimes there are wider factors as well. Mark mentioned one example that I was involved in as president of E&I, where we had actually looked for an outsourcing option, but the market couldn't deliver that. And so that's when we had to go back and say, actually, plan A hasn't worked twice. Can we think about a plan B? And then it was a matter for Mark to see if he could fit that into his busy schedule, which to his credit he did manage to do.
Now, if I could just turn to, I'm sure it's everyone's favourite topic, Fermain Cafe, but specifically in relation to that case, there was a decision to appoint external legal resources. What formal process was followed to determine the use of external legal resources as compared to the use of the law officers of the Crown?
Sorry, that was obviously our first point of call is law officers of the Crown. They look at in the same way, look at their workload, look at their resourcing. And for this one, they didn't have the resourcing to be able to do it. So it was their recommendation and their decision. So it's always through the law officers to outsource that piece of work.
Okay, so it was the law officer's decision that it needed to be outsourced.
Correct.
How do you set any constraints on that before you start operating?
How do you mean?
In terms of you going to external resource, how did you set your constraints on how much resource was used?
Well, all litigation is managed within accordance with the litigation directive, which again I suspect Jason probably can speak to in greater detail than I can, but that would govern the management of any case.
So in any matter of litigation, there was a requirement to, if it goes over a certain threshold, I think the threshold has recently changed, but is it approximately about £40,000? 40,000. So anything where there is a matter of litigation where we are at litigation risk, there is a requirement to ensure that there is a paper written and presented to the principal committee or the committee in question, and then there is a consideration around the risk and the value based on the principles of what the purpose of the paper is. So there is an evaluation around whether to proceed or otherwise, and that's under the litigation directive, and it's often taken with legal advice to a committee.
Would that include law officers' legal advice that...
Yes, so ordinarily, as Advocate Lyle has
available
referenced, so it would ordinarily be a member of Chambers who would attend or give advisory to a committee. And this is wide-ranging. This isn't specific to SPU. This is a litigation directive that sits right across all aspects of delivery in the public sector.
So to take external legal advice, you would need internal legal advice in the preparation of the document.
So in terms of the setting of the litigation directive, or in terms of the particular
that
case?
process that you just described.
Yeah. So when the litigation directive was put together, the law officers of the Crown supported and advised on what that directive should be and should set out, and the protocols that should be followed and the guidance that would need to be adhered to in those circumstances. So
just I think the question is specifically in relation to this case.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was in
No,
relation
it was a general case. That you need, if you
But
decisions to external.
that's in terms, but not in terms of the preparation of the directive. In terms of the management of litigation.
Yes.
Yeah. If there is litigation which is being advised by external lawyers.
yes.
Is St James's involved in then advising the committee? And
But you just said yes.
Not ordinarily, not necessarily. It depends very much on the particular circumstances. So they wouldn't necessarily have.
Could be the
oversight.
case that they get
It could
involved
be
in
the
legal
case.
advice to actually.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yes,
Okay. Well, so yeah, so that so to come back to that point, Jason. So that in those sort of circumstances, in that scenario, it would be a P&R political committee decision.
Or a principal
Always.
committee, depending on the nature
Or
of the case.
but
Yes,
In all these cases, it's always the buck stops with the political committee.
they would have a consideration, yes, around,
When you say have a consideration.
and a decision on the recommendation, or otherwise, yes.
Okay.
P&R also has a role in the management of litigation generally, in respect of other committees as well, depending on the level of the litigation.
So if it's
From my memory of the directive.
principal committee, we could have had another layer of discussion.
If the litigation had principally been involving another committee, then the financial risk would clearly be something that is of interest to P&R and is the subject of oversight through P&R.
And that is that another threshold to the 40,000, or is that similar threshold?
It largely.
I don't recall.
Yeah, I haven't got the. I can't recall the specific amount, but it largely depends on if the litigation risk is escalating and a committee is unable to resolve it. Would be within their budgets, or there is a risk, then they would be flagging that to P&R by way of caution.
And is there sort of an expected value associated with that risk, or
There's
is that
not a
calculation?
specific value.
So once the threshold of 40 has been passed, there isn't another review?
No, it's based on the legal advice and the evaluation on the risk, and also it's also around whether the risk is insured as well.
To hire externals.
Sorry, can you repeat the
You
question?
said it's based on the legal advice of the evaluation of risk. If the project involves externals, who's giving you that legal advice?
So the legal advice would come from Chambers and or with external legal advice, but ordinarily, in most cases, it comes from the law officers' chambers. The financial risk and that dialogue would be taking place with Policy and Resources Committee, and there would also be a consideration around litigation risk and whether that risk is insured, and then that paper would be re-evaluated based on the circumstances and the risk that would be presented.
Okay.
And would continue to be evaluated
On an ongoing basis.
through the case management.
Well, that's my question. Yeah. Once you pass the 40, there isn't another threshold that automatically defaults. It's just a...
It's not a fire and forget. It's very much,
No.
as you'll appreciate, litigation evolves in a unique way, case by case. So there will be decision points as that litigation
And it would be
progresses.
returned for consideration on, as Deputy CPS says, on an incremental basis, depending on the development of the circumstances.
What sort of increments?
Depends on the circumstances and the case at hand.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Yes, I think we've got time for a few more questions just before break, I suppose. In terms of just saying check again. You mentioned the PTOM, which is the, I'm going to go have a guess here for my acronyms, Property Target Operating Model. Okay. I assume was derived after much external advice and consultancy, but I'm going to take a presumption there. Again, you go back to your document, you say service, you go back to, this is complete change of tack here, this is filler before break, as it were. You mentioned this previously, Mark, about the operational level, it's in the briefing document, and following the instruction of the PTOM, service standard documents were drafted, and this came up in an internal meeting, we were asking this, but you said they're introduced to regulise the levels of service that building occupiers can expect from the SPU. As this is an internal service to internal occupiers, it was not considered proportionate to utilise more formal, management-intensive and rigid service level agreements that may not drive and encourage the right collaborative working relationships across the internal departments. And I remember reading that, we had this discussion, it was like, how does everyone get charged to rent them internally? And now we've got these internal. How is that better than a more transactional rent? You know, to an economist here, I like the price mechanism. How is that a more efficient process?
We don't charge rent. That's not a decision for SPU. That is a decision that has been taken, not a SPU, but there is a view that those wooden dollars actually is not something that we do. So we don't charge.
When you say the decision is taken, it's not an SPU decision.
No.
But to ask you the question, because this said you've got these rigid service level agreements, and would you think that would be a more efficient mechanism to?
A more rigid agreement?
Charging rent, do you think that would be an easier process to manage, a more understanding? Would it be an easier process for a property unit to be able to?
I think charging rent adds another layer of administration, so we would have to do that. There is always the argument that charging rent against budgets may help drive good practice in terms of space utilisation and areas. But it does come with other areas of where you are just moving money around different departments. So at this stage, as I said, we don't charge rents for internal service provision. And I think that goes down to how do you charge a school, how would you charge the hospital, or are you just talking about actually operational buildings? So it's, if you look across the estate, a lot of what we deliver is not, Sir Charles Frossard House and an office. This is a school that operates from a premises that is the premises that they have, and the same with the hospital, those areas. So how that rental model for those kind of buildings would be quite odd.
There's one really interesting example, and actually it engages your committee, because Edward T. Whedon House is actually not owned by the States, it's owned by the States Insurance Fund. And so there is actually an argument, as former VP of ESS, to say that actually those people who are not engaged in the direct activities directly related to that fund should actually be paying rent accordingly. But it's a really interesting area.
Yeah, I mean, and ironically, the question came up in committee, and that's how we, it's like because of that particular example. And to me, it seems illogical, counterintuitive, not to do a hard and fast.
Another point that doesn't rise, and possibly why it's being asked, is that when the states cost something out, if it's not charging rent, it's almost impossible to work out what the true cost of service provision is, because there's always numbers that are missing from those estimates. So I think it's not just about moving wooden dollars. I think it's about how you demonstrate value for money generally as the states of Guernsey.
Just to add, I appreciate Mark's comments about the rent, but actually as a committee, you are charged, or we are, correct me if I'm wrong, we are charged for the involvement of in-house expertise in terms of project costs. So there is some element of charging out, or something to keep the economists happy anyway in that respect.
Probably not, no.
Yeah, yes.
Not a job to be happy, though, is it? No, I know.
Sorry, if I can just add one comment on that. I mean, it's certainly an area which I've raised in the past as to whether it is appropriate that we should be thinking about. I mean, I think it's, as Mark has suggested, I mean, there are clearly reasons why you would do it, and there are clearly cost implications of doing so in terms of administration and so on. that need to be considered. I would suggest that probably one of the biggest barriers to having done so far, certainly not precluding it ever being appropriate in the future, simply has been a matter of states' priorities in terms of where the focus has been in terms of people and resources and the projects they're trying to deliver. So whether it's been for example, within the Treasury team, the IPSAS project, or within the property team of actually bringing them together as part of the SPU and so on. So that doesn't necessarily provide a justification to the question, but it provides perhaps a practical explanation as to.
Yeah, I'd accept your point, but I think also I would ask is that I suppose the other side is it can be seen as a barrier to looking at where service provision within the states might be better handled outside of the states, because you can't ever get a true cost comparison. So the cost of privatising, for want of a better word, is often then looks a lot higher than the reality in context.
Can I bring one other element in? I mean, I think it's not as simple as it is in the, gosh, it sounds like the heavens are opening. It's not as simple as it is in the commercial world, where you're dealing with a for-profit entity. It's very different when you're dealing with something which provides a social good, such as education, etc. I mean, health is slightly more complicated, isn't it? But actually, the other area which is really interesting, and I agree with Gavin's comment that this is ultimately, down to prioritisation of resources which aren't as fulsome as, if we had any amount of resources, we'd certainly have done it. But I think another really interesting area is consistent charging mechanism for the public realm. And I know that's something that was brought up when we debated the change to the alfresco permit system. And actually, I think we would benefit as an organisation and probably as an island if we took that more consistent and, dare I say it, more slightly commercial approach to public realm, as well as just properties, so charging rent.
I agree, but again, to this economist at least, from was it School of Bogus Economics? I can't remember which. It seems perverse not to use what is the price mechanism of money. It's only a unit of account exchange. It's not evil money, but if we started off this sort of session talking about, I asked about efficiencies. How are you measuring efficiencies? And if we're not even using rent as a tool to discipline our use of resources, then I do query how we're able to demonstrate and say, yes, we've achieved more efficiencies, because we're not measuring anything. We didn't have a measure. So, and again, I appreciate you wanted to come back to it, Jason, but that I just find it, I would like to understand if, like I said before, if the property unit delivers value for money, to the public purse, and if I'm struggling to see how we're measuring this.
On the subject of efficiencies, I've just jotted down, while the conversation has gone, a number of areas where I think we can demonstrate efficiency. So, for example, in the number of properties, specifically the rationalisation of administrative hubs. So I remember when I first started at E&I, we were based in Raymond Fowler House. We were moved out of there as part of the property rationalisation process. There have been a number of disposals of surplus properties, especially those that are substandard. So that's another example. Mark's already mentioned the rationalisation of staff and getting better value for money out of them. We've got various programmes which are looking at energy efficiency, and I agree that's not something we are yet able to measure, but that's definitely a priority for the team. I know, because I've seen them in action on training. The maintenance programme, again, as I said earlier, has been much more consistent. The compliance, Mark's already dealt with. Generating capital receipts, reducing the outgoing liabilities, waste I mentioned earlier, and just generally making sure that we are delivering better fitness for purpose. Now, not all of these are easily measured, but I think we can demonstrate across the board a number of efficiencies, even if we're not yet at a point where we've got a little checklist with numbers in each box beside them, because some of those are still evolving.
Well, sorry, Deputy Chairman, I see Jason nodding to you there, but since that sort of response wasn't proffered when I asked the question, we'll leave that to subject to debate. I mean, at the end of the day, being in less properties doesn't necessarily make it more efficient. Spending more money on maintenance, yes, and rationalisation. unless there is a clear, consistent measure that the efficiency being driven, that you actually set out to achieve first, and at the end of the year, this will be better. A lot of it's just qualitative, I'm afraid. But we'll stop there, because at 3:25, we'll have a 10-minute break for refreshments, for convenience, for anybody that needs to, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes' time. Okay, if we're ready, we'll start 30 seconds early. I'm a golfer, it's just tee-off times and stuff like that. You appreciate that, do you? Okay, thank you ever so much. We'll reconvene for the second half of the session. And yes, I decided to cut everybody off there because I was desperate for a cup of coffee, clearly. But we were talking about value for money and efficiencies. So actually, I'd like to continue that theme across into this half. And in terms of value for money, I think, Deputy Camp, you have a question that you'd like to set off with?
Yeah, and I think it's important to set the scene. So I think from this perspective, it's, the public, largely through the media, sees sort of consistent reports of, overspend, prospective or otherwise, insufficient spec, poor communication, recurrent delays, lack of maintenance, and things like that. I'm also aware that people generally scratch heads around the perception that sort of prime properties have been sold at undervalue. And that when there are interactions with the public, they can often appear fractious. So having sort of reflected on the fact that, sort of disposals and maintenance were before the breaks have described as an area of efficiency, I'm interested to hear about how that plays out against the public dynamic and the media dynamic that's clearly there. And quite rightly, the public is asking questions. So what do you think is the primary driver of the consistent and recurring themes that are playing out in the public spotlight?
Sorry, can you run through your list of themes again? I didn't catch them all.
Well, there's a lot, and I could have included a lot more. I've tried to limit them. Overspend, sort of specification, poor communication, recurrent delays, properties sold at undervalue is certainly a perception that I hear and have been told a lot. Interactions of the public have appeared fractious. Now, this I appreciate this is what we're hearing in the media, and then that sort of encourages public debate around that. But I think that it is something that P&R and the property unit should address, because it is so widely out there.
So it seems to me, but please do correct me because I might have misunderstood you, but it seems to me as though we're conflating a lot of different things. So some of the things you listed in terms of overspends, etc., seem to be related to capital projects.
What I'm trying to do is so in particular you talked about disposals and maintenance of property and things like that as being areas of efficiency.
Yeah.
So given that sort of, I suppose, larger message at play, how would you address those comments? Because clearly when a property is sold at undervalue, that's a disposal. Clearly when there are other things that have happened around maintenance, that's the SPU has described, that's part of their remit. So how does the SPU sort of feed into and those themes, and what comment would you make on them?
I will leave some of the details and technicalities because I don't think that we've necessarily materialised any disposals in this time, maybe one or two, but I don't think that's been something we've dealt with directly. So I'll leave details of that to people more on the operational front line. But what I would say is that we hear some of those criticisms, and we as a new committee are actually very determined to get to the substance of any such concerns and make sure that we are addressing them. I'd go back again. I mean, we've only been in these roles for a few months, so we haven't really had a chance to get our feet properly under the table on this. But we are actually really keen, speaking on behalf of the whole political committee, to do exactly that. And actually, I think your review is going to be really helpful. I think it might help for those listening to understand that this is not just a scrutiny management committee hearing. This is part of a much bigger process. And so, I mean, I'd be keen to hear actually before the end of this hearing what your timelines are, if you have any idea yet. But we're actually really looking forward to participating further in any information that you might want following this hearing, but actually also seeing what recommendations you have, because we are certainly not sitting here and saying that this, is all perfect and we've got everything right. This is very much an evolving process, and I think there have always been criticisms, and I'm sure some have been substantiated and some some less so. As I say, I have to leave the details of any sort of specifics in terms of valuations or whatever to people who are actually involved in those things. But we are very much very keen as a committee to make sure that we are taking a consistent and professional approach to these things. And one thing that I would also like to pick up on, because it's something that is really personal to me, one of the things you mentioned was a sort of fractious relationship. Now, I don't know, because I wasn't a member of the former Policy and Resources Committee, but I can say as someone who wasn't a member of the former Policy and Resources Committee, that the impression I got was that there was quite a bullish political approach that had been taken. And certainly that is something that sits quite uncomfortably with me. Now, as I say, that is just a layman's impression. I don't have anything to substantiate that. But I can say that that sort of approach is not the kind of approach that sits well with me personally, and I don't think it sits well with the rest of the committee. And I would be and I am keen to make sure that we improve that interface, if you like. So I think that is an area that I am personally very, very keen to address. And sorry, I will hand over to people with a better grasp of operational details when it comes to things like valuations.
Okay, thank you. I would, Deputy Camp, if I could just refer back to, you talked about how the public perception and really from an SPU perspective, I'd just like to refer back to the 2019 STSB policy letter, because that has real relevance here. And Deputy Sloan asked Mark the particular question around benchmarking around operational services. Now, that is incredibly difficult to do when you are dealing with, ranging from pH clinical environments, laundries, power control rooms, incinerators, swimming pools, hydrotherapy rooms. It's incredibly difficult to get standard benchmarking. Mm-hmm. However, there were guiding principles that were set out in the 2019 policy letter, which are the fundamentals of what was PTOM, the Property Target Operating Model. And those are key elements that we continue to benchmark around the progress that we have and continue to make. As the President says, it is a journey, and the policy letter set out that actually this was going to be incremental and it was going to go over a number of years. Mm-hmm. That work sets out that it was around looking at arrangements, and it recognised that the efficiency and the effectiveness of the services was not there and it was not fit for purpose. And there was a need to improve the corporate management of the estate. The SPU senior management team have made great strides in delivering that, and sitting around things, as you use the example of disposals, are key processes. So where you look around that, they will have market valuations, they will be brought to the table, they will be evaluated, and decisions will be made as part of that process. They were looking around the estate of the property objectives, and they need to be aligned with the corporate objectives. We talked about the property rationalisation, the number of properties that were either sold or relinquished in some way. Or each one of those properties went through an evaluation, looking at its fit-for-purpose nature. Mm. Did it meet modern environment? Was it client-focused? Was it energy efficient? Was it going to meet new accessibility standards? So all of these considerations were taken into effect around went through a process, data was collected, and then a decision was then taken as to whether they should be removed. Are you then, I suppose, saying, because, I mean, clearly this is a question around public perception. Yes. And lots of things are being done. So can you make an undertaking then that as part of both sort of efficiency and effectiveness measures, you will take the temperature of public? And that could be through things like understanding the column inches that are being filled up in the press around disputes, and also potentially other sort of consultation and feedback type services, in order to, because we keep on talking about KPIs, and the public seems to be one of the stakeholders that needs to be taken on this journey. So what I'm saying is that, and it may well be that we need to do more in the public domain to explain where we are on that journey. Mm-hmm. As we've gone through the discovery phase, we're in a process of stabilising. We're able to then build more metrics and more data in. But what we are able to demonstrate as an SPU, that we have got better working locations, and that is a continuous process. We have the team, and we've increased and they continue to increase the improved professional practices, the consistency of those standards across those services, and the consolidation of that work, and the improved value and return from the estate. And we'll be able to, if Scrutiny Management Committee and if it's helpful, we can sit down and have a more detailed discussion to go through some of those against the principles of that policy letter and how we've evolved that over a period of time.
Okay, Jason, I'll thank you for that. I'd go bringing up the target operating model, because actually if you go into the internal audit report of 2023, in summarising, they said that the PTOM workstream brought together property and estate staff that form all committees into a single unit. And you've talked about you've got consistency of a team and consistency of locations, and you talk about quantifiable deliveries. But in the internal audit report, it says this model went live in 2022. The original savings targets in the investment case have fallen short, but work is continuing to identify further savings opportunities. So in 2023, the internal audit said you haven't actually delivered the savings that you purportedly have, and earlier on we're still not there. But I would like to specifics in terms of, Mark said earlier, this is about the best value for the portfolio and value for money. How is it then, this process that you've gone through, that we still have the Cattell and the King Edward empty and falling to rack and ruin?
Okay.
So, are you talking specifically about the King Edward and the Cattell? And
I mean, how is that delivering value for the portfolio, given the process that Jason's just described?
Do you want me to
talk
to those? I've got a few. I've got some areas as well that from Deputy Camp that I'll pick up as well, because I think there were some areas that weren't touched on. I think Cattell Hospital, there are still 300 staff working from that site. So it is not a non-used site, and up until recently it also had medical records stored on that site. So far from it being an empty site, it is not. It has also been, P&R have included it in their submission under the IDP to try and get it included into the local centre, and that opens up far more development opportunities for that site. So looking at the future and how we look at these sites under our strategic property plan, which tries to look across all of the sites and say what are we using them for and what is the future for them, not just next year, this year, but actually looking at all of state's objectives within this capital portfolio, but actually those projects that are longer term, that are sitting outside of that, they're all going to have property needs and property desires. Actually, we need to make sure that we've got space to do that and the estate to do that. So we try and forward plan and look across all of those properties to take a longer term view about that. So Cattell Hospital forms part of that. As I say, it is in use. King Edward is the same at the moment. So King Edward is broken down into various sites, but at the moment we have services being delivered out of that building, albeit they were moved there temporarily. They are part of a programme to move out, but that EBME runs from that building, which is electrobiomechanical medical equipment, which is essentially where all of the beds from the hospital and all the electrical items go up to be maintained and looked after. On that site, you also have the Peruke and Carrefour sites, which are also in operation. So that site is in operation. And I'm sure you've seen recently that we've been progressing a progress into a care village there with heads of term. So that site is actively being moved forward. So I think there is a perception that we have a huge amount of sites that are empty and not being used by something, whereas they are. And I think Cattell is a case in point where actually I don't have, at the moment, there isn't a funded programme to move those staff. That would sit in the principal community hub, which is a pipeline project. So obviously, a lot of the property moves, and it is a big jigsaw puzzle, is absolutely reliant on a lot of other capital programmes. So I can't just decide to move those people somewhere because there is no capital allocated for me to do that. So it is a big complex jigsaw puzzle that we have to try and work our way through, but we are taking a longer term view when we look at all of those strategic sites.
Can I just put in a little point? Sorry to interrupt
Sure.
you, and I'll hand
If
back.
I may, Lindsay, because I just wanted to let Mark finish and then come in, because I know that he's got quite a long list.
Okay.
I could,
It was just.
No, it's okay. If it's on that subject,
It was.
I'll
It was
move on
just to say that actually SPU doesn't work in isolation on this. I can speak from experience that there is an awful lot of cross-committee coordination that goes into that strategic portfolio with strategic property planning, and understanding the different needs of different service areas and committees is a big part of that jigsaw puzzle that he explained as well. I think he's already dealt with the problem of decants.
I mean, that was a theme of earlier, wasn't it? We kept asking, where's the buck stop? Who's in charge? How do you allocate this? It seems a very almost impossible task that you have here with all these competing different objectives.
Yes, I think it is. The strategic property plan does attempt to pull that together. So it provides a strategic framework looking across those sites to say, here are the properties, here's what they're currently used for, here are the other uses that potentially could be used for, how they align with the government work plan and those priorities, but also what would have to happen with them, because there are always options for it. And I think if you look at various other, as I say, principal community hub, if you take that, or potentially law enforcement, all of those are going to have property requirements. Now, where they would go, but actually the States of Guernsey has quite a limited property portfolio, despite there being, views otherwise. Actually, if you look at our portfolio, it is operational buildings. Yes, we have a lot of schools, but they're all in use. We have a lot of, we have a big hospital, it's in use. We have a lot of other operational buildings. We have a lot of service delivery areas. The properties that you've mentioned really are about the only ones that are empty. So I think that there is not some swathe of properties that aren't in use or don't have something in mind for the future, where we do have to look at it much more strategically rather than let's just sell off all the assets straight away.
Okay, look, I appreciate the consciousness of time, and obviously we'll just accept that the Catelli has been actively moved forward for now, and obviously a lot of the other properties that I consider directly have been actively moved forward. But I want to bring it back to value for money, and Charisma, in terms of had an area of value for money that she wanted to ask, and probably I cut her short before the break. But
so we understand that the state's legal costs in relation to Fermain Valley matter are reported to be in excess of £100,000. What alternative options for achieving vacant possession, which I understand was the purpose of the legal case, such as negotiation, mediation, alternative dispute resolutions, were considered before and during the litigation?
I feel as though a political answer would be the most appropriate one to give. The challenge is that as politicians, we were not involved in that. We came to this process very, very late. What I can say is this is kind of what I was referring to earlier. My sense is, although I cannot evidence and substantiate it because I was not around the same committee table, that the predecessor political committee took a more bullish approach than I feel we would have done. And that is a sort of strictly political comment I do appreciate. So although I can't answer your question directly, I can give you a sense of how I agree there may have been other options that had there been a different political makeup around that committee table may have been preferred. But
would it be possible that someone may be able to look and see what the records reflect, or are these records not going to be available?
I'm sure we're very happy to work with you. This is part of a review. We're happy to share any information that can be shared to that end. And all I will also say is we have to be careful because this is still subject to a legal process. I think it is fair to say that we are trying to that those options are still being explored, but I have to be very careful because this is still
possibly, if I can bring it back to something which won't be subject to a legal process. What formal process was gone through to select the outsourced legal provider?
I think that's a question for Chambers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, not to put my words into your mouth, Deputy Summary, but possibly I'm inferring that a different character set of the political actors might have come to a different approach.
All I'm saying is I don't know because I wasn't around the committee table at that time. So we want to sit here and be able to answer your questions as fully as possible. However, we are not the people that are able to provide you with a definitive answer. All I can give you is a general sense, and it is purely a personal perspective because I don't know, I wasn't party to those discussions, that I agree, and this ties in with the point that Deputy Camp was making earlier about this perception that, we end up in disputes. All I can say is that
But
as a committee, I think we are keen to understand how we can end up in situations like that less often or not at all in an ideal world.
But the most recent leg of that was in this administration.
No.
No, I mean, I think we were not party to the decision making that has led up to this, and I think we can really only talk from where we are, and I think we are clearly keen to reach a mutually agreed solution, which is if it's possible to achieve that outside what remains of the court process, that would be a good outcome.
Okay. Well, okay, moving back to something that is, I think, in this administration, I'm going to ask about, if I may, Leal's Yard. And I suppose in terms of value for money as well. And I appreciate, and thank you ever so much again for the pack and the SharePoints. I have gone back over the files and seen how many times the topic has been discussed at the previous committee, this committee. My first question is in terms of value for money, what was the process that went through to determine that the approach that's now being adopted is better value for money than the one that was previously being pursued?
Can you be specific about what you mean by previously?
Well, previously my understanding was that the estates was in discussions with private sector developers with a view to the private sector developers to develop it. Now, my understanding is, obviously, the first meeting of our term, that the estates had then decided to buy the land. And my question is that seems there was a statement by the previous P&R president that there was discussions in the press about how that process, that journey had come to an end. What was the process to determine the route that's now been decided was a better route than previously?
I think we need to be clear that the previous route was no longer a route. That was not something that, because it was a route that involved two different private entities. So one being the co-op and one being the development partner omnibus, and that process was no longer being progressed. And so, I mean,
the dates decided it was no longer being progressed, I assume. I only read what I read in the media,
Again,
and the parties have said they were keen to continue. So,
Mark is probably in a better position to comment on all of this than any of the rest of us. But again, to be clear, the commitment to enter into that contract was entered into before the beginning of this term.
yeah.
So,
sorry, Deputy Senator, which contract?
to acquire the
So
site.
that had already been enacted.
Yes.
Yes,
at
so
the
although
start.
completion has taken place in this term, the contractual commitments.
So those were the
Extended
meetings.
contract.
Those were the 3 meetings in June that I can see that the States Property Unit attended. P&R presumably that would
Yes.
have been So the sort of gift, as it were,
Yeah.
of
Yeah,
amongst
so,
many.
so again, going back to your question, Deputy Sloan, we're not really in a position to comment on.
Presumably you will have been briefed subsequently and taken into administration. You would have been presented with this case for pursuing this route, for the commitment, the commitment to capital expenditure on behalf of the public sector, and that must have been discussed. You would have been briefed, I assume, about what the states effectively is committed to spend
Yes.
on this route.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically a question of, did we want to progress? Do we want to see progress on Leal's Yard, or do we want it to continue to be effectively a barrier to regeneration in the whole area? I mean, I think that's essentially what it came down
Well,
to.
essentially, it's a route to actually spend public money up front, as opposed to allow the private sector to do the heavy lifting. My question is, when was that case developed and presented? Now, you're saying it wasn't.
I think it's a mischaracterisation.
How is it mischaracterisation? You would have gone through to commit to a expenditure, to a purchase a piece of land, and then subsequently have committed effectively to the remediation work or to do that. There would have been a business case presented to the committee, surely.
To the previous committee.
Yeah.
So
But you would have had sight of that case. You would have presumably been briefed in this term.
we were briefed that the commitment had been entered into. So
And when was that business case developed then?
I think we've got to go back. So the Leal's Yard, as you'll have seen from the meeting has been something that has been in consideration by the states for a long period of time, various different approaches over the years. We were asked to do a comprehensive assessment of various proposals that have come through, including technical reviews, and ultimately what was being offered by a development partner and the owner was assessed, and whether that was something that was looked at, and ultimately that deal did not happen. So it was assessed that that was not something that was going to come forward, and therefore that ended at a point in time. And that is documented about why, the reason that happened. So that is a deal that didn't get over the line and therefore stopped. At that point, there were other discussions that were with P&R around what they wanted to see for the future of the north of the island, and actually that involved much wider reaching look at infrastructure and how that could be used to make significant improvements, as again has been publicised, through infrastructure improvements through the north of the island, and actually how that could be delivered through the states of Guernsey. Now, they're presented an opportunity after the deal with the development partner and others had come to an end to look at a different option with the landowner. That P&R committee was very keen to do that because they saw a greater benefit of actually bringing it into the public ownership to be able to deliver infrastructure in other areas rather than it sitting there without any development. So a decision was made to progress a different route at that point, and that's where that got taken forward in terms of those papers and a P&R decision to proceed in the way that it did.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chronology of this. Yeah, what my question is, quite clearly that was the case. My question is, when was my time in the States was a 5-case business model. When was the business case put together to demonstrate that this route and this capital commitment and this expenditure would provide an economic benefit, a financial benefit, a commercial benefit? The 5 cases. Well, there's another 2 there, isn't there? When was that done? Because I'm looking at the chronology and I'm thinking I can't see how that work was done.
It was a high-level review that was taken, but it was a decision that P&R took based on the information they had and the information they were able to.
So there wasn't a 5-case business case model put together to justify this?
I think there was as I say, there were papers that were taken to
It's high level. How high level?
Consider.
How high level are we talking?
I would have to go back and check all the papers, but it was, as I say, it was high-level papers.
How much, in terms of the future commitments, what's the expectation, ballpark figure of the capital commitment that we've entered into to pursue this route?
Are you assuming that it's all public money?
Well, presumably there's a business case put together that this will have been worked out. And I'm asking, what's the current estimated public capital commitment of the whole of the Life project? Because you must have done this before we entered into this.
Yeah, I think we are looking at infrastructure across not just that site, and I think that's the point of this, that this is about looking at infrastructure across a number of sites. And yes, there are numbers that were put together at very high level, and they are being reviewed and looked at, but the next stage is to work up the detail of all of that.
So the commitment was done without a real idea of the scale of the commitment?
No, I think it understood the scale.
And
what's that scale?
I haven't got the numbers in front of me, I'm afraid.
But I think also there are clearly going to be a number of different options. But I mean, I would imagine that around the P&R committee table, when this was being presented, it essentially came down to, I mean, we've had, 25 years of Leal's Yard, of being promised that Leal's Yard is going to be progressed. And frankly, its complete lack of progression has stymied that whole area. You go and talk to businesses in that area, they'll tell you. Talk to residents in that area, they'll tell you. So ultimately, I can imagine that for the previous P&R committee, some of it came down to the fact we knew that infrastructure and the provision of infrastructure was a key barrier. So ultimately, it came down to the fact that or the question of whether the states wanted to be an enabler in the regeneration of the second biggest centre in the island. So well, I think that's probably part of it. And there are clearly options for how it is developed going forward. And we've seen some of those suggestions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we've got a real pressing demand for housing and for regeneration in that area, we need to take into account some of those things. It's really difficult to do on a site-by-site basis, for example, flood defence and infrastructure, that actually the States is uniquely positioned to make a positive impact on.
Deputy Secretary, I agree. All that sounds marvellous, but my specific concern was about actually the commitment that has been entered into without, it appears, the necessary understanding of the commitments that we've effectively signed up to. And again, if this was just one isolated case, I could, I seem to recall over the last term, and this isn't anything to do with this committee, the members of this committee, the states got into the habit of buying land that wasn't fit for purpose. And we have land in the north of the island that has been bought that wasn't zoned for development in the idea of putting it for key worker housing. There's land so there are sites in the north of the island that would not necessarily have been purchased just to leave fallow for 3 or 4 years. Because my understanding is that is not a good use of capital. And I hate to be an economist about money, but if you waste your capital, you cannot deploy it somewhere else. And that could have been deployed somewhere else to improve the estates. Maybe in the Cassell we could have been doing something rather than actively considering it. But I appreciate that is not the decision of this committee. My concerns are, and it will come out, is the necessary thinking and concerns for value for money for the taxpayer was not done when that decision was made.
To be taken you have to take into account, or they would have taken into account, the opportunity cost of leaving Leal's Yard undeveloped and continuing to be an albatross around the neck of that area. I wasn't around that committee table when that was being done, but also there are options, and I think it would be naive to suggest that we are looking at 100%. The only option in front of us is 100% taxpayers' money go into that. I don't think that would be a realistic way forward. So I very much anticipate there are multiple different ways you can do this. But the important thing is we need to get the infrastructure sorted out in a way that benefits the whole area. And actually, we've got a unique opportunity with Leal's Yard to do exactly that. And that's not something necessarily that could be done in private ownership. That is something that is a fairly unique opportunity for government to do.
Deputy Secretary, I completely agree. The opportunity costs, I'm sure, but will be real. But I'm not entirely convinced that they were worked out, and that's my consideration there. And it being a jolly good idea is, to me, is not a sufficient justification for action. However, I'd like to change topic again. In terms of, you talked about housing and such. In terms of completely different topic, key worker housing. And again, I remember the requête back in 2022, is it 2023, in key worker housing. I know it's come up sort of every year in terms of P&R. May I ask, in terms of strategically approaching, just a line of the committee's thinking on where it wants to take the key worker housing? It's been a few years.
Well, I mean, again, of course, the State's property unit has responsibility for the management of key worker housing, but of course the question of key worker housing more broadly doesn't sit with policy and resources. So whilst clearly we're at the stage of thinking about where our housing priorities are more generally as part of the whole government work plan process, and that obviously of course key worker housing and so-called affordable housing is very much part of that thinking. We're doing that as in our role as the coordinators of policy, rather than it being part of our policy brief.
It's my apology. The briefing that was provided obviously referred to in terms of the review being undertaken in the State's property unit, looking to support that. And I just wondered if there would any more detail coming forward that wanted to be shared at this juncture. But
sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Yeah, I mean, an important distinction probably to be made is that key worker can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I think it's probably helpful to clarify that we mean states workers in this respect. I'm not sure I'm safe to be
doctors, nurses, teachers.
No, well, yeah, but Yeah. But there are lots of those that aren't necessarily employed by the states, which is why it gets confusing. So I think that clarification is necessary. One of the things that we are keen to, and we have started the process of getting a better handle on, is I'm very, very mindful of the fact that the way that we manage key worker accommodation or states worker accommodation has an impact on the market more generally. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I, in particular, but I know it's shared by the committee more generally, really, really keen to make sure that we are managing it in a way that meets the needs of the organisation and the island without creating unintended negative impacts in the wider housing market. And that is a really, really important point. I feel very strongly. I'm not sure I'm safe to get started on this particular subject, and we might not get out of here on time. But that is something that we are very alive to, and that is something that we are working on at the moment as well. But as Gavin rightly points out, we have responsibility for one aspect, but not necessarily the policy around it.
And just because I think I've understood your question second time, not first time round, in terms of the review and the purpose of the review. I mean, clearly, again, historically, the key worker housing, as termed, was principally the responsibility of the Committee of Health and Social Care for their staff. So we now have the situation where P&R through the state's property units are responsible for looking after that, but the income and expenditure side of that still goes through the Committee of Health and Social Care. So I think for me, in terms of understanding what the review is trying to hopefully the output of that review will be actually what is the best model for the public sector to own and manage accommodation for those kind of workers. Actually, query, would we be better for that to be the responsibility of a housing association, for example? Would that be a more efficient way to do it? Would that provide better value for money? Those are the kind of questions which I think this kind of review needs to deliver for us. But clearly, we're not in a position really to comment on that at this point. But that would be my expectation, because it's a bit of an anomaly, to be honest. In terms of where we are at the moment.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give a subtle hint to my fellow panel members that we might have things like project management or accounting and finance, or just so that we let them know where we are. I thought it'd be good. Or role in major projects, because I am cognizant we've got about 10 more minutes to go. And I just wanted to come back. I'm a numbers person, I suppose, and come back to the numbers to sort of set the scene for this final bit. Last couple of years, obviously the property units, the budget's gone up 18% nominal terms, probably 9%, probably 5 or 6% year on year. What's driving that? Do you mind me asking?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the breakdown of the budget. It's around about 50%, about 15 million of. So a large proportion of our costs are staff costs. Around £7 million of that is utilities. So we are, obviously those can be, utilities certainly can be volatile, some of those areas. So actually our year-on-year increase is relatively small in terms of those.
Sorry to interject, but they're not that volatile, they just keep going up.
Yeah, well, yes. Yeah. In terms of our usage, weather dependent. So as you can imagine, the hospitals and the schools particularly, the utilities spend on some of those is very considerable. So there is a fluctuation there in terms of that. So that drives obviously that budget growth. And obviously we are driving energy efficiency as best we can within those, but we're still seeing growth in those areas. areas.
Mark, can I just interject there just on that point of the 326 FTE? I think it's important just for going back to Deputy Camp's point around perception. I think it's really important to acknowledge that 88% of those staff are frontline staff. So they are our hospital porters, they are working in our laundries, they are our caretakers in schools. They are not primarily clerical workers, although very valuable that are they. These are members that are working out in the community across all of those 420 sites that we manage in some way, shape or form. So they are actually colleagues that are in the front. That's what makes up the primary part of that 50 million wage bill.
Yeah. And I think if I come back to some of those areas, sort of grounds and gardening, 1.2 million of that, repairs and maintenance and servicing, so that's the stuff that's sort of the bit of painting, the bit of maintenance, is £7 million of that budget. And I think when you look at the fact that we've got an £800 million estate, some of those questions that were asked earlier about that perception of why isn't more maintenance done, the reality is that we have to make difficult decisions all the time on that maintenance. We have to direct those resources, and that's across the routine budget, but also that capital budget, and that comes back to that prioritisation. We are always having to make very difficult decisions. So there will always be things that can't be done. And I think we've seen changes as well. And I know, glyphosate and other areas actually has had quite a big impact on us. Now, rightly or wrongly, I'm not here to debate that. But the reality is when we had that, it was much easier for us to keep on top of weeds at various things. So we've had to increase that maintenance to be able to do it in a different way. So those costs come with time and areas.
I look forward to the quantification of that.
External cleaning in itself, sort of £2 million. These are big numbers, but actually they're driven by it. But these are the public perception areas. So, when you hear people, why aren't those gutters cleaned? Well, we can only afford to clean them twice a year. And things grow in between the time. So there's lots of those areas where we do have to make those difficult. So our budget is very constrained in terms of what we have to deliver for the size of the estate. So I think,
So it's cost pressures rather than service, more things being delivered.
There are three other key areas of this around some of those services where we've seen, as Mark talked about utilities, is the over-inflationary increases that we've seen on some of these contracts has been quite significant. And these are in key areas or contracts where we simply don't have a choice. These are essential 24/7 hour services where we can't just rest a contract or wait. We have to find a way of going out to market. And sometimes there are not... But we don't have choice of suppliers. I think the other key point is around making sure that where we are going out to deliver these services, one of the things that certainly I've witnessed over the last increasingly over the last 5 years is, and Mark mentioned this at the beginning of the scrutiny hearing, is our statutory requirement around regulatory and compliance work. And the work that we are having to invest and our teams and our contractors are having to invest in order to ensure that they meet their minimum critical standards across a whole range of work is also increasing costs.
Okay, so like I said, so it's cost, it's not actual doing more, but it's still a 9% per annum increase in budget. But
some of it is doing more.
Driven by doing more.
We're trying to, and that's part of that, we are trying to deliver more. I mean, obviously, we are doing our best with the money that we have, but we are trying to deliver more with the monies that we have. So part of that is to look at how we can drive that efficiencies and do things more efficiently to be able to deliver that. But yes, the cost pressures are high, and I think if you look at the inflation in the construction sector, so for us trying to deliver a lot of those maintenance jobs, that they have gone up significantly in the past 4 or 5 years. And then on top of that, those compliance areas, so health and safety compliance, various other areas, has just pushed the cost of those projects up. So in every area, we're facing bigger and bigger cost pressures, whilst also trying to at least stand still, but actually try and deliver more. So it is the budget increase is very marginal, considering, I think, the size of the estate that we're trying to manage.
And you talk about the size of the estate being 800 million.
Yes.
You mentioned that a couple of times. Does that include the hospital site valuations? Yes. Right, so you take out the hospital, the schools, the actual portfolio is not particularly large, I thought then.
Those are the big, but if you look at if you look at the health estate, so you've got the hospital is a part of it.
Yes, but if you look at maybe the non-specialist...
One of the issues there is also not only around the size, it's the complexity. And when you're looking around,
hospital's more complex.
We've seen some very
office,
exciting new capital developments coming online, but as we set out for you, our estate, not only are we working on the backlog of some of the maintenance work post-COVID, We've also got an ageing estate, so
Yeah.
that is also comes to...
But Jason, I just wanted to stop you there. Where I was going was, like, if I break out the hospital, I break out the schools, the rest of the portfolio
It's smaller.
it's quite small.
Absolutely.
You know, and in terms of a management task itself, is that much more manageable? Task?
Yes, but it's very diverse. So if you look at the
Still got
what's
crematorium?
left, you're left with crematoriums. Absolutely, you're left with. Alderney Breakwater sort of falls outside. Oh well, we do the work on that one. But if you look, that's then office blocks, kiosks, all the other sort of bits and pieces, historical sites. So grounds maintenance. So you've got playing fields and various other areas. So there's lots of other bits that come in. So it's the diversity of the estate that's probably, if you look at it, and if you talk to a big commercial property manager, they'd say that value of the estate, you could have one building in London that's worth that. The reality is that ours is so diverse, and it's there are so many different facets to it, and they all do very different things to deliver it. So our team has to be quite skilled in lots of different areas to try and deliver the property solutions that we do, and that comes with it a burden to try and do that, because what you have to do for a castle is quite different to what you do for a hospital, which is different to what we do for Foots Lane grounds. So yes, if you look at our budgets, yes, the lion's share of that, and of course that is predominantly our staff budget, sits within that HSC area, because that is the big areas, our housekeeping and our laundry teams there, and portering and all those other sort of predominantly some of those 24/7 services as well. So yeah, those are our big cost areas. Education, those estates are big and lots of, but the rest is smaller.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thinking out loud, it just sort of seems the rationality of putting it all together in one single homogenous unit, sort of this target operating model seems a bit, to me anyway, this simple soul, questionable, because it's so specialist and so diverse. I'm just wondering how are you expecting to achieve efficiencies going forward over the next 5 years?
I think what we have found actually is out in those wider estates prior to PTOM. We had a lot of people that were working in property that weren't particularly specialised, that were doing their best in a lot of areas, or that were having their budgets used for other things that were not necessarily budgets when they weren't in the control, when they weren't centralised, so committees would use them for other areas. And then other things like the statutory compliance and oversight in various other areas were not as efficient as we needed them to be. There are also pockets of, when we launched the PTOM, what we found is pockets of poor practice in some areas. The compliance was not where it needed to be. Some of the workmanship wasn't where it was, because actually those people, whilst doing an excellent job out there, didn't have the central support and the professional areas that the centralised property unit could provide. We've also been able to layer over that centralised health and safety areas so we can provide advice into them. So what the model has enabled us to do is actually provide expertise across all those areas. So we can utilise the central core of staff. So we have at the hospital M&E specialists that actually help out in the schools estate now. That never would have happened before. Our health and safety advisor can go in and go across all of those areas. The way that we manage water hygiene and water quality is now consistent and being rolled out across those areas, so we can have consistent reporting. And we are managing to use staff across those areas and the learnings from those different areas to look at, well, how do we doing help desk and how are we centralising these services? How can we look at energy efficiency across all of those? How can we look at the procurement of all these areas? So let's say for our grounds maintenance contract, a separate one for the hospital, a separate one for the schools. Actually, well, why are we not combining these together to drive efficiency? So I think the formation of the state's property unit, I'll be quite evangelical about it. I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. I think having disparate teams all around the estate trying to do their best was not the most efficient method.
And it comes back to the point around data and the point that you raised before. We do now have line of sight across all of these in order to look at the prioritisation against that spend, recognising the different priorities of the different
Okay, I get that. And very quickly.
I'll give a different perspective. So from a committee perspective, I can tell you that as the former president of the Committee for the Environment and Infrastructure, it's really frustrating having a team of people who specialise in nature and land management and all of that, having to deal with a heritage building project because that is not their core expertise, and actually it's diverting that expertise from what they should be devoting it to. So that's really just to illustrate Mark's point. If we don't do it this way, let's have a think about the implications for that. And I completely agree. Let's not lose sight of the fact that it used to be very disparate and a very poor use of resources.
Okay, I appreciate that, and nice to have line of sight. But I'm saying in terms of the site of the internal audit report, saying the savings weren't delivered in 2023 of what was originally promised.
not
Hold on, let me
point.
finish. And then in terms of unable to quantify, we've got budgets going up. What I'd like to see, and
One
we're
of the other
working
key
together.
things
Hold on
around
a
the
second, Jason.
2021 as
Jason,
well is,
one moment.
the-
One moment. Let me tell you what I'd like to see. I'd like to see where the plans are for efficiencies going forward, so that we've got something to measure against. I think that'd be very useful.
Just on that point, just on that 2021, I think it is important for the record to note, and we absolutely recognise it is a continuous programme of works around that improvement and efficiencies. We were delayed by over a year due to COVID, so we actually did the PTOM transition 21 into 22. So
Yeah.
that's where you'll see more efficiencies coming through as we phase that.
I get that, but it's now 2025. That was 2023. And when I asked what efficiencies have been achieved in the last 2 years, no answer was forthcoming in
Well,
terms
it
of
was,
in
which is
terms
a
of
bit late.
quantification. But less sites is not a quantification of an efficiency. We can be more efficient on one site. We can be more efficient on 5 sites. But I'm going to ask my fellow panel members if they have any final questions.
No, I
Right.
don't.
Possibly, and this may just be my misunderstanding. You talked about 50% of the costs being staff costs. When you're talking about staff costs, are you talking about employees of the states, or are you also including the outsourced service providers?
Employees.
Employees only. So any money spent on your ground maintenance contract with an outsourced service provider is going to fall outside that 50%.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Look, I'd like to finish on. Deputy Summer, you have a final comment?
I'm just hoping that when you summarise, you might be able to give us some foresight of the
Yeah.
timeline going.
I say I'd like to finish on time, but I'm going to sort of speak for about 2 minutes possibly. But in terms of the process, obviously this is our first public hearing as a panel, which has been an enjoyable experience. Thanks for coming. We enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And like I said, we have three sort of areas that we want to see. I can't do lists. I'm going to have to look them up again. It's really quite embarrassing, isn't it? It's value for money.
Value for money.
Thank you very much. You are a lists person, Deputy Sampier. I am not, clearly. We have had to put a call out to the departments for evidence. I'm not aware people have been beating a path through our door. Maybe they're all still, like the budget, getting their feet under the table, lay of the land, that sort of thing. But we have had a call for evidence. We would like to, obviously there are some questions that we'll follow up with written questions. Again, we're not going to be doing the Rule 14 and making it difficult or anything like that, but there are some questions that did appreciate all the documentations. As you appreciate, we went through the SharePoints. We did. So thank you very much for that. We will be looking at that over the course of course of this calendar year, and hopefully putting together some sort of response to the final response earlier in the new year, but some dialogue back and forth about some question areas, and actually just put our comments on those 3 areas and just frame a short report on that, and hopefully move forward. And one of them clearly being the provision of setting of targets. I think for us to be looking to achieve, if we can't measure if we don't set what we're trying to progress against, how do we know whether we've got anywhere?
Can I just reiterate on the record that we are more than happy. We appreciate a hearing is quite a time-constrained process, and we don't necessarily have the details that you're after at our fingertips. We are really, really happy to sit down and work through with you in whatever format works for you, any of that detail that we haven't been able to provide today. And also, I can speak on behalf of the committee. We're really looking forward to your review and taking on board whatever recommendations it comes up with. So thank you very much for choosing us as your first subject, and we're really looking forward to seeing what comes out of
Having
it.
just done a couple of on-sites, I know what it feels like. It could be in a guinea pig. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much, my fellow panellists, and thank you all much for coming. And the technical staff, thank you very much for being able to live stream this event for those people that have got very busy diaries. Thank you ever so much.